Move the booster seat back. The scripture reading for today can be found on any number of newspaper front pages. John 15:13. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends, in this case for his nation or for his country. As a teacher, social studies teacher, particularly American history, back in Webster during the 60s, 70s, 80s, yes, and even part of the 90s, I always felt it was my teacher obligation and maybe my patriotic duty to make sure that as we headed into the Memorial Day weekend, we made sure that we remembered what Memorial Day weekend was all about. So I would typically go up on the blackboard, which eventually turned green, which eventually has now turned white, but go up to the blackboard and I would put Memorial Day and then throw it back to them in terms of developing the concept, you get the idea, just like we would have done with Sabbath, right? We test your sermon, we could have put Sabbath up and get your responses. So we put Memorial Day up, and guess what the first response was from the students? Day off, right. We get the day off, it's a 3-day weekend, all right. The next ones were probably predictable too, since Webster, where I taught, was on the lake. So the next one was, oh yes, picnics at Webster Park, or going out onto the lake, boating, maybe even swimming, maybe water skiing. To the south, camping at Letchworth Park, or barbecues at Grandma's house. Barbecues, no, hot dogs, hamburgers, brats, wots, whatever. And then, of course, finally, someone would venture to say, oh yeah, I left one out. The drive-in theater opened. But then finally someone would say, I play in the band and we go to East Rochester for the parade. Teacher moment. Oh, band Memorial Day parade. What's the parade all about? Lots of cheering, clapping. It was always a lot of fun. What was in the parade? Well, let's see. We got the Little League, and we've got the sailors, the Navy guys, and the Army guys. Oh, yes, that's right. Then finally it would dawn on them what I was after. And they would say, oh, yeah, it's the Memorial Day. We need to remember those who were killed in the war. That was interesting when they talked about being killed in the war. Somehow they always associated with World War II. I don't know whether we thank Brokaw for that, or I'm not sure what we think. But at any rate, but the mission here was what Memorial Day means to me. My brother was 14 years older, and on his graduation in 1943, he was only 17. So my father had to sign the papers that allowed him to go to Chicago for Great Lakes for his training for naval service, and then he served in the Navy then from 1944 through 1945. Got a picture here of my brother at age 18. Don't know whether there's that much resemblance to Chuck, but at any rate, that's Bob. Bob was to go on and serve beginning in 44. He was sent over on a destroyer escort into the Mediterranean, which was not the place to be in 1944. Between being part of convoys that would go into Sicily or go into Tunisia, trying to fight the German forces both in Africa and in Europe, it was a tough situation, to say the least. He then went on for anti-sub patrol in the North Atlantic, and then at the end of the war, he made his way over to the Pacific. So it was a bit of an ordeal for him, and what did that do for us? What it did for us is cause a morning prayer, and I was responsible once I got to the first grade to take over my sister's duties to lead the morning prayers for our brother who was serving in the armed forces. And then my mother and father would take turns for the evening prayer. And it was a anxious time, to say the least. Probably made even more anxious by the fact that you would go to the movies and it would be preceded, some of you know, by the RKO movies footage of what was going on, where, unfortunately, in the Mediterranean. And also there would be coverage in the Life magazine that would arrive each week. So this 4.5, 5, 6-year-old had a good number of nightmares in terms of imagining. I always found it curious that at night I would crawl under the covers and pretend that I was digging myself into a foxhole to make sure I was safe, which made no sense at all because my brother was stacked in bunk beds below deck on a destroyer escort. But anyway, in early 1945 came the moment of Jimmy Clapper's death. Jimmy Clapper lived, 3 houses away from us in Mansfield. And whatever morning that would have been, probably February, March, it was a cold morning. That I do recall because all of a sudden there was wailing and screaming and crying from Bernice Clapper as she came up to our house, knowing that my mother was her best friend. Jimmy's gone, Jimmy's gone, Jimmy's gone, Jimmy's gone, and came into the house, and we had a hug for her. And even as a 6-year-old at that point, I knew that I needed to be part of that group hug. And in a sense, I was a part of that because Jimmy was always the one that would stop while I was out there playing my solitary croquet game in the backyard, and he would stop, get off his bike, and come up and join me for the croquet game, and invariably he would always let me win. So Jimmy was, an important person in my life as well. So Jimmy was gone. Of course, that really heightened the depths of the prayers because there was my brother headed off to the Pacific, going by Okinawa, which had just been freed. And that was the last barrier for the invasion of Japan. The thought, of course, was that my brother was there as part of the whole giant fleet that was building up to invade Japan. So talk about the intensity of the prayers. Personally, Memorial Day, I was reminded as I saw the poppies in our garden. Winnie, did you have something to do with that? At any rate, as a Boy Scout, late 40s, early 50s, that whole Memorial Day weekend was always taken up with, on Friday, helping the VFW, the American Legion, or whoever sell those poppies. And then on Saturday, we would go first to the Protestant cemetery, where we would put the flags for those who had served. I don't think we really worried about whether they had actually paid the ultimate price, but practically every serviceman's grave was given a flag. And then even on Sundays, Pam, when we got to church, we had America the Beautiful leading off, Battle Hymn of the Republic. And we would always close, I can still remember the organist playing each one of the service hymns. And then that was followed by the minister getting up and announcing the names, including Jimmy Clapper, of those who had lost their lives. And it was followed by taps, and I can still remember that. So it was not a good time. Do have the feeling, though, that we all paid much more attention and cherished what that ultimate price had been than the succeeding wars, particularly in Vietnam. The first tragic personal tie that I had with giving the ultimate price was with Tyrone. Tyrone was a middle school, junior high school basketball buddy of mine. Tyrone loved basketball. Tyrone thought he was a great basketball player. Tyrone loved 10th grade social studies because he was introduced to Alexander the Great. So Tyrone became Tyrone the Great. Tyrone was much shorter than I was. I was the gangly 6-foot, 140-pound center. And he was the dashing guard, much more athletic and much quicker, and he always would tear around me in the one-on-one games. And when he would score the inevitable 2 points, it was always, they didn't have high fives, fist bumps, whatever. It was always just, Tyrone! And of course, I had to imitate that, so I became Chucky! And so we had great games. We alternated driveways. After a while, we had to give up on Tyrone's driveway because the neighbor lady got quite irate, as she said when she came out half-dressed, screaming at us. It's enough that I hear that basketball thumping and thumping and thumping and thumping and thumping. But all this craziness about Tyrones and Chuckies, stop! My mother realized that we were just adolescents having a good game, so she didn't care with our form of trash talk. And so that went on. But in late 60s, I must admit that when I got the phone call from my mother back in Mansfield saying, Chuck, I hate to tell you this, Tyrone was killed. He was in a helicopter crew that was shot down in Vietnam, and he's died. I was just literally left speechless. I hadn't seen Tyrone since probably my sophomore year in college, but those of you who have ever had the loss of a colleague, friend in this case, for a long, long time, and being that close to Tyrone, that one really hit home. When I was teaching at Skidmore's University Without Walls, we were up at Comstock at the prison, and one of the members of my class, actually the only white person in that class, there were probably 15 in that American history class, they called him the chief. And during the break time, over that year's period of time, I got to know who the chief was. And the chief loved history, loved biography, couldn't give him enough biographies. Not only would he read what we were supposed to read, but practically a biography of week. And he always said, I always wanted to teach history. I always wanted to be a history professor. He said, I wanted to go to Rutgers. I always wanted to go to Rutgers. But he said, I was never the student. They never accepted me. I couldn't get into Rutgers. So I went to a community college, hoping that I could get my way in. And then that damn Vietnam draft lottery got me. And off I went to Vietnam. Served in Vietnam, evidently served quite well. When he came back, as he said, it was the most discouraging period of my life. He said the war was bad enough, but when I got back, it was almost as if they resented. I was viewed, given how everybody felt about the Vietnam War at that point, with disdain. They didn't quite go so far as to spit on me, but he said, went for my interview at Rutgers, hoping the fact that I had served in the war would get me in, and it didn't. So he said, then I finally found a job as an enforcer, the tough guy, because he had been in martial arts and was a formidable size. So they called him the chief. So I got a job as an enforcer. And as the enforcer, working in the Maritime Union, he had some interesting conflicts. And in one of those personal hand-to-hand conflicts, he managed to do a number on the person at the other end of his blows. And he hit his head against a wall and had a concussion and died. So the chief was now serving, I think, 20 to 30 or whatever number of years at Comstock. So it was just a matter of circumstances and draft lotteries. But he wanted to go to Princeton. I wanted to go to Rutgers, and he was so thankful that Skidmore afforded him the opportunity to get his degree. And he said, you're my Rutgers. So I was always happy with that. Many of the other people who were in that same class who were black, a couple of them had actually served in Vietnam. Others had older brothers that had served in Vietnam, and their view of Vietnam was not good. The two that had fought there said, you couldn't possibly train me for fighting in that war. It was hell. He said, I lost two of my buddies in the mess hall at the base. He said, you never knew what was going to happen. And he said, I hated the war, hated every day. Every day was hell. Every day was a nightmare. He said, I don't know what they told us we were there fighting for, but he said, I know what I was fighting for. I was fighting for my survival. I was fighting for, they've picked up on that term, I was fighting for my band of brothers. We were all just fighting to get us out of there. And they came back. So there again, you have, we really need to stop and express our gratitude and respect and honor for those who did give that ultimate price or went through hell. My brother went through hell. I think the only time in my life that he actually sat down and talked about his experiences, he didn't want to talk about them, and I saw why. My uncle was visiting, and he had been in the European theater, and the two of them were doing their war talk. My brother finally opened up and showed us the picture of his graduating class there at the Great Lakes, and he pointed to somebody who was one of his good buddies who had served on his same destroyer escort. He said, we found a sub that evidently was trying to make repairs, and they were sitting there on the surface. And so our destroyer escort approached, and then they realized that we literally were sitting on top of them. They got up and manned that deck gun on the submarine and started firing at us until they could submerge. And in the process of submerging, that deck gun deck con once all hands were on deck and my brother was called up from his usual duties to help feed the ammunition. That buddy that he had from Great Lakes was shot right next to him. And he could never forget that. And he could never forget that, and he could never forget later, he said, I can't forget Lindley, my uncle. I can't forget that after that, we went after that sub. We had them cornered in the bay, and we hit them with the depth charges, and we saw the results of that. And we saw the results coming to the water, and he said, we celebrated. He said, now I don't celebrate. He said, now all I know is that 60 people on that submarine paid the price for war. And he came back a changed person, came back with nerve shot, addiction to tobacco, married Frances. They had 2 kids, but never really loved his wife. He admitted that later when he divorced. So I came back because she wrote me letters for 2 years. I owed it to her. But he married her anyway, paid the price. Really remember my father's view of what toll that had taken in 1956, at the time of the Hungarian Revolution. As an 11th grader, I was fed up with what the Soviets were doing to the Hungarians, and I was saying, why doesn't Eisenhower take us into Hungary? Sound familiar? Take us into Ukraine, right? Why don't we go in, help fight that war? At which point my father, who was always a very mild-mannered man, pounded the table, said, I will hear no talk of that. I will not lose another son in another war. And he got up and left the table. I looked at my mother. My brother was lost in the war. My brother's here. Charles, your brother, you don't know, but we do. Your brother was never the same. So, yes, I admit, I never served in a military capacity. As a matter of fact, I spent most of my time between 1960 and the present time trying to protest against wars and trying to oppose intervention. I have some mixed feelings about what's going on over there in the Ukraine right now. But whatever the background, I think we do really need to be much more in a state of resolve to make sure that we honor those who did give the ultimate price. Just as important, those who went through hell, we need to recognize and thank them for what they went through in terms of trying to do all of that. And God only knows this week we need to pay respect and with great sorrow see the anguish and the suffering of those who, like Bernice Clapper, coming up that street followed by the Marine that had come to the door. He's gone, he's gone. I mean, the depths, the heartbreak, having lost my own son, but not in battle. I can only imagine the feelings of heartbreak that you have on that. So that's my Memorial Day reflection in terms of how war and death and the hell of war and the heartbreak have hit upon me. Kate mentioned that John wasn't going to be here today. I gather from what Kate said, evidently John lost his father in the Second World War. And Dave served in Vietnam, and certainly you know a lot about what I'm talking about in terms of what that was all about and what happened. So there he is, my brother. God bless his soul. As a result of his addictions and his nervous whatever, he had a heart attack at age 44 and died at 51. And unfortunately, his wife died of pneumonia at 52, and his 2 sons, one died at 59 and one died at 61. So that part of the family history is sad. But let's really try to remind ourselves to really think about the meaning, significance of Memorial Day. Okay? God bless.